Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of The Raw Men. And today we're talking to Dr. Karen Garst. She is the author of Women Beyond Belief Discovering Life Without Religion. How do you do, Karen?
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to it.
So we're talking today about your book. When did that book come out?
It has a October 1st publishing date, but Amazon has already shipped the pre-orders, and there is a Kindle up for pre-order, and eventually there'll be an audiobook. Barnes & Noble also has it listed. I'm not sure about the bookstores per se yet.
I'm in a similar situation with my book. I don't know about the bookstores yet. all I can follow up is on all I can follow up on is Amazon. Yours is also being done by Hitchstone, is it?
That's correct.
Okay, same publisher as with mine. Okay, so what? Tell me about it. How did you get the inspiration? What is it?
Well, on June 30th, 2014, the U.S. Supreme Court issued its decision in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby. And as you know, there was a previous decision, Citizens United, that basically said, oh yeah, corporations are people, got it. So in this particular decision, Hobby Lobby, which is a craft store, said, well, if I'm a person as a corporation, I guess I can have religious views. So they filed a lawsuit against providing certain forms of birth control to their employees under the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. And 5 Catholic men on the Supreme Court were in the majority, and they didn't have to provide it. And I became incensed. I am a second wave feminist. I remember before birth control. I remember before legal abortion. And this has to stop. I was having lunch with a friend of mine. She said, you should write a book. And I said, well, the only thing I can get passionate about is atheism. And here we are 2 years later.
Okay, thank you for dropping the line about the second wave. Somehow that comes up a lot. So I understand my wife also contributed to this. This is the one that my wife contributed to as well.
Yes, it was wonderful having her. A friend, one of my authors, when I tried to reach out through social media, said, well, I know Lalonda Raw. Let's get her. And she connected me with her. And I had the opportunity to meet both of you at the Reason Rally. So we really appreciated her writing an essay for us.
Okay, so the idea behind the book then is, what was it, 22 different women giving their perspectives?
Correct. What I did was I started out with friends
Mhm.
and asked them if they'd be willing to tell their stories about leaving religion. And then I broadened that. I started to attend the Humanistic Greater Portland, the Center for Inquiry in Portland, and solicited additional authors. And then, as I said, I reached out through social media to get additional women. So there's a broad range of women, 17 to 70, quite a bit of diversity. The religions they came from were all Judeo-Christian. In my next book, I'm going to explore other religions, but for this book, it's limited to those from Judeo-Christianity. But there are also 3 women who were raised secular, not surprisingly in Europe, who tell their stories about coming to the United States and how different it is.
So they obviously don't have a deconversion story to tell. They just have I guess, an encounter perspective. Is that what their
Yes,
angle would be?
you know, when you have children and they meet other kids and how does that work out? One of the women, a good friend of mine from England, said, you know, in England, if you ask directions, they say it's at this pub or turn left at that pub. And she said, when she got to the United States, they said nearest church. And she said, I don't know where any of the churches are. So she had to learn to navigate differently in the United States.
Yeah, well, we noticed something like that when my son's mother lives like 45 minutes from us, and we made this run on the road where we were counting mega churches
Ah,
between, and I think there's 11 mega churches.
that's absolutely amazing.
Yeah, well, that's a word. It's just
Well, for air, I might say something else off air. Do the pastors all have jets, or is that just a few of them?
that's fortunately just a few of them. But anytime that you can fit an entire stadium, anytime your sanctuary requires a stadium, I think there's a problem. I think it's a little over the top. So one of the things that I really like though is an interest of mine is people's deconversion stories, and what I like about that is, I mean, I've heard lots of people give us explanations about when they adopt religion. You know, the reasons, if you can call them reasons at all, are always so vacuous. I mean, it's like it's so often you get to like a handful of repeated themes. Well, I used to be a drug addict, or I used to be alcoholic. But otherwise, the story always revolves around changing your life somehow, right?
Mhm.
And they're always in a desperate situation where they have to change their lives, and then they find some new addiction, which is a new obsession, which they can now use as a placebo focus that they don't, of course, realize that that's what they're doing. Yeah, honestly, you could pick up just about any hobby and become invested in that and change your life the same way. People just don't realize that that's what's happening. But when you do deconversion, when people walk away from religion, the stories are wildly different. And you can never predict what it's going to be. I mean, it's never the case that it's just that same old story happening again and again.
Oh, I think
And
that's very true. And there's really a wide range of stories in this book. Some of them, get out your handkerchief. They're a woman raised in a fundamentalist church, the shame and guilt, where she was told you not only commit sin, but as a woman, guess what? You are sin. And how she struggled that with her whole life.
as a
Uh,
woman, you are sin.
that's what she was taught. It's the first essay in the book, Anne Wilcox, and she developed this, debilitating perfectionism. She felt guilty about everything.
Apologies. Apparently, something moved outside. Shut up. I have sentries.
We have a dog too. But yes, that's her father and the pastor told her, as a woman, you are sin. And I think what's important about this book, it tells women's stories because if you look at virtually every religion today, the people who are abused most are women. And they're considered subordinate. I did an appendix at the end of the book that talks about the subordination of women in the Bible. Of course, I grew up in a Lutheran church. Nobody told us the stories of Jephthah. Nobody told us the stories of go to the red tent. And they just glossed over all that, or the misogynistic things Martin Luther said. I mean, I was raised as a Lutheran. We never heard any of that.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting because you're talking about it as a systemic problem, and it certainly wasn't limited to the Bible. The crap that Martin Luther said against women was so deranged that I had to wonder where do you even come from that you can hate somebody so much this way? I mean, was he a repressed homosexual? Is that the thing was? Because I mean, he had utter disdain for the filth that he imagined women to be, and
Well, and there's
where we over commercialize, the female form, he exaggerated into these curves that are celebrated, throughout our media. He saw as a distortion that this was like a disfigurement.
Yes, well, and if you look back at some of the early Christian fathers, quote unquote, Saint Augustine, Tertullian, they're terrible. I think Saint Augustine probably single-handedly did more to denigrate women in his writings that were adopted by the church. The original sin concept came up through Saint Augustine, and basically he blamed it on women. Carnal lust of women caused original sin. So I think it'd be interesting if a psychologist looked at, what's the impact on a young girl who is raised in a religion that tells her she's worth nothing, and to kneel down every night and pray to God the Father, versus a feminine divine, as an example. And I think that would be a very interesting research study. But certainly Anne, it took her a long time to come out of that. But the good ending is she called me, or she emailed me a few weeks ago from the Oregon coast and said, I was out. I was sitting quietly. I had an epiphany that I was serene for the first time in my life. And I think writing the essay made a difference. So that kind of makes it all worthwhile. And I think the book also offers models to women who are on the edge, or men who, gee, I can't do it. I can't leave my family, or I can't change. And I think we're all motivated by models. If we see something, we can be it. And if you don't see anything like that, it's harder for you to imagine. I wanted to tell you about, because I know all of your work in science. I had an evolutionary class on evolution in 9th grade. Now, this was a time there was no intelligent design. Nobody complained about it. The church didn't say anything. My father was religious. He totally believed in evolution. And I wrote this paper on early hominids, and it was fascinating. But I never saw a woman science teacher. I never saw a woman scientist. And I could have pursued it, and plowed through, but there weren't any models. There weren't any examples. And I think the impact of that on women is very strong. Fortunately, that's changing. But as we talk about women leaving religion, this book gives them models to say, oh, I don't have it that bad, or if she can do it, I can do it.
On that note, I mean, I mentioned something about one of my teachers in school, and it was assumed that the teacher was female because it was a teacher.
Ah, absolutely. Well, yeah.
And it was a female that made the assumption, just like you said, going to the stereotypes, but then also figuring to the stereotypes. The fact that it was a science teacher changed the stereotype. When I specified it was a science teacher, so it was a male teacher.
Absolutely. Well, when I was graduating undergrad from a Lutheran college there back in Moorhead, Minnesota, I applied for a scholarship to graduate school to Dartmouth. And I was interviewed, and the only woman on the committee said to me, why should we give it to you? You just get married and have children. And, didn't get the scholarship, went on, got a PhD anyway. But here, the woman was so affected, or those beliefs were so inculcated, that even the woman said, why should we give the scholarship to you? So maybe there was some repressed desire on her part to go to grad school and she didn't get to go. But, today, of course, I would have responded to that. But at 21, not so much.
Okay. And I'm still, when you brought up Martin Luther a moment ago, it triggered another memory. I remember that Martin Luther said about, getting pregnant and everything. He said that that's the woman's job, and that's all she's supposed to do. And that he described women as being, I think it was him, wasn't it, that described women as like baby making factories?
Oh, and he said if all they are to have babies, and if they die, no loss. So
yeah,
yes,
that was him.
that was Martin Luther.
And so you were raised Lutheran, but they didn't tell you that part.
No, they didn't.
Well, it seems we are joined by Lalandra.
Hi, Lalandra.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Okay.
I wanted to tell you on air, thanks so much for including writing your essay so that we could include it in your book. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
So the deconversion stories, and like I said, there's huge range, and sometimes it's the content of the Bible, which is, I think, the number one option. People tried to read the Bible, and that's what did it. Secondarily would be the hypocrisy of the church, and science facts tend to be tertiary if they're even on the list. It's usually something else, which I think is interesting. What would be the general idea behind the deconversion stories in your book?
Well, I think most of it's personal, and it involves some kind of relationship. As I said in the beginning, this woman who is affected by this guilt and shame. Another woman, and you talked a little bit about the hypocrisy, she had a relationship in college with somebody who wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, and she's hauled before this tribunal, and they're ready to disfellowship her, which means excommunicate her, and she learns later that one of the guys was having an affair with a married woman. So very hypocritical. There are a few about science. There are a few about feminism, learning about women's rights and coming of age, and then taking a critical look. Some of them through, like me and one of the others, reading a lot of books of the Jesus Seminar. That's what did it for me. I read Bishop John Shelby Spong's book, Resurrection, Myth or Reality, and that was the last little thing I was holding on to. I said, okay, that didn't happen. So some came through just reading criticisms as well.
I knew a woman that had converted to Christianity. She was originally, I think she was originally pagan, and adopted, just like assumed Catholicism for whatever reason. And she was explaining to me, I think it was Catholicism, but she was explaining to me that in a marital relationship that she was looking for, she needed someone that would make all of the decisions for her, because now that she's Christian, and she put it that way, now that she's Christian, she needs to be dominated and surrender to a man as the head of the household.
Yeah,
And
some
I was
therapy
bewildered.
sessions would be good.
Yeah, I found it a strange concept that anybody would say that, okay, well, now that I believe this, well, now I have to consider myself a lesser person, suddenly incapable of what I've always been able to do till now.
Very, very odd. I also wanted to mention that the public broadcasting in the last two nights has featured women who were forced to be married, primarily because of religion and community. And I think it's that whole idea is gaining momentum, because there are still states that allow somebody to marry a child bride. And so this was a move, somebody who's, 16, 14, something like that. And this was a move to change that. And they were telling these women's stories.
Okay, so when you said child bride, you were talking about 16 or 14. I've seen laws to that effect in the United States, but I was thinking about Middle East, where it's half that.
Well, it's obviously even worse. But there was, I believe, a 12-year-old in the United States that an older man married. Just, it's disgusting. I mean, there's no other
Okay.
word for it.
Yeah.
I don't think it's strange in a way, because that someone who becomes a Christian wants to be submissive, because if you're going to be consistent and say that you believe in the Bible has messages all throughout for women to be submissive to their husbands. And as a former Southern Baptist, they were always preaching from the pulpit to be a helpmeet to your husband. And I know a lot of modern Christian women, that don't think they should be submissive. But if you're going to be consistent and believe say you're a believer, you should follow what you believe in.
Yeah.
And there's certainly instances in the New Testament where it says, be a helpmate, do what he says. The head of every woman is a man.
And when you're in church, you sit and be quiet, and you never instruct. There was another passage where you don't ever instruct a man, or where a
Correct.
woman is prohibited from teaching men. So, honey, did you say what was your contribution to this book?
The book is like an anthology, of course, of women's stories leaving faith. And a lot of times people ask the question, where are women in the free thought movement? And that those numbers are growing. So maybe we're talking about why we don't see them in faith communities or speaking or stuff like that. Because the numbers are that women are starting to approach like 46% of free thinkers. So they're there. Maybe the question is, why aren't they engaging with the community? And I see more and more of that, because I go around a lot with ARN to different free thought communities, and I see more and more women. So, but I think the book was doing is telling these women's stories. And so I told my story too. I actually have to correct my story, because I had my dad's origin as German, and I did a DNA test, and I'm actually half British and Irish mainly, and with some Northwestern European thrown in there that's not specific. So maybe he's more Dutch than he thinks. And so, but my story was coming out of Southern Baptist and a Catholic background, both fundamentalist. A lot of people in America think of Catholics as modern, and they accept evolution, stuff like that, and liberal. But because I'm half Vietnamese, Catholicism for me was more fundamentalist. So coming out of that, and my story is a lot like a lot of people's stories, in that we were conditioned to believe as women that we needed to, we were an addition to a man. like an afterthought. Oh, I need to make women in the Genesis story, and but we once you leave all that behind, and think of yourself as a simply another human being, there's really not that many differences between men and women. And there's no reason why women should have to take a second place or be a helper to a man. She should be a full partner.
Now you
So
said you got this idea because of a Supreme Court ruling.
Yes.
Okay. Was there other factors involved in that?
Well, um, I had been an atheist for a couple of decades, and I didn't really join any other communities. I was happy to sleep in on Sundays, and we raised our son secular. At times, I thought, well, golly, in English class, he's going to need to know stories of the Bible. But as I went through the Bible to try to teach him those stories from a literary point of view, I had way too much commentary, so I begged, and it didn't work. But it was really that decision that prompted me to write the book. I had not been that active, and I have met, in addition to the two of you, an amazing number of people these last 2 years who've been very helpful. We help each other out as authors, and it's just been a really great experience. But my motivation was, as I said, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I remember what it was like before birth control was readily available. When I was in college, our student newspaper, which I was working with, published an ad about an abortion phone number in New York. And the administration impounded all the newspapers and wouldn't let us send them out, and they were eventually destroyed. And I don't want women today have to go through that battle again. I mean, we should be done with reproductive rights. They should be a given. I was in Canada recently. They have no restrictions on abortion. You go to a hospital to have it done. And we're just way behind on that. And I think of these young women coming of age, I don't want them to have to do that. And I do believe that religion is one of the last cultural barriers to gender equality.
Yeah, I remember talking to somebody in Europe that was saying that that women in Europe had achieved all of this, that they achieved full equality. And I said, we started going through the list of things that women got in Europe that we don't have in the United States. And they were impressed. You mean women don't have this in the U.S.? But we thought you're so yeah, well, no, we never got around to it. Germany maybe, but not us yet. Well, I'll leave that.
Well, when you look at some of the factors, whether it's wage equality or paid maternity leave, the countries leading that list and providing those, Iceland comes up at the top often. They are the least religious countries who provide the most equality. And I know there's people criticizing some of the data, but I think it's still there.
I know I may be biased on this, but I think that the reason that there's that correlation is that, that the problem with the misogyny in the Bible is that it is systemic. So it's a self-perpetuating thing. And so when you walk away from that, then you walk away from all of the kind of bigotry that went attached to it.
One of the things that, excuse me, I've studied over the last 2 years, and I've read, over 100 books. I wanted to come up to speed a little bit, is the elimination of the feminine divine. And if you go back to the Paleolithic, you see all these figurines that are women. Excuse me. And in many cultures, there were goddesses. In some of them, it was a sole mother goddess. And so this feminine divine was worshipped. And you see, even throughout the Old Testament, people complaining like, hey, we have it bad off. When we used to pray to the Queen of Heaven, we were better off. I'm going to go back to do that. And then you have the Israelites in Babylon. Well, what is the key myth in Babylon? Enuma Elish. And what happens there? Marduk, the big, one of the male gods, says to his buddies, hey, if I kick off Tiamat, the female god, and get rid of her, can I be the head honcho? And she cuts this sea monster Tiamat in half, a story that's repeated in the Bible and Leviathan and other areas. and they destroy the feminine divine and become the sole male deity. Well, that's exactly what happened in cultures around the Middle East, and Judaism is the longest lasting monotheistic religion, but this was happening. And just finally, Karen Armstrong, who's a writer, talks and hypothesizes it took 600 years for the Israelites really to become monotheists. And you see that in the Bible. So the impact of eliminating the female divine and putting the female down and making her responsible for sin and having her be unclean was happening all over.
My interpretation of Genesis and blaming Eve for the original sin, I had to take it as a parable. There was no other way that this could possibly be a thing. There was no way that you would cut these trees down and build a canoe out of it. You know, they're obviously not actual trees. So this is just a parable to tell a story. And the way that I interpreted it at about 11 years old was that, you know, in the Wild West, for example, they taught us in school that originally there was just men going into the West, and it was wild and woolly, and everybody's got their guns out and all of this. And then when they started bringing their women in, now they've got community and everybody's peaceable and all of this. And I said, okay, well then maybe this is what's happening in the Middle East in this version of this story, where you can't attribute to women that you have this generation of civilization, which is, you know, another parable that I'm reading into the story that wasn't really very explicit. But you're gonna credit women for having taken you out of this primal state, this age of childhood that you can never return to, and you've got to make that into a bad thing, and that it was her fault, and then it can't even be her idea. She had to get it from something more intelligent, like a snake.
Well, the story of Genesis is really interesting because the Canaanites worship Baal, El, Anath, and Asherah. And Asherah is a goddess that is worshipped in nature, as many of the female goddesses were. They were linked to nature, the cycles of women, the cycles of the moon, etc. And one of the things that's associated with Asherah is a tree. That you go out in nature, and it's a pole or a tree in Hebrew. And what better way to put down the goddess than use the symbols that used to represent her? And the snake represents the goddess in ancient cultures. The Egyptian hieroglyph for goddess is a snake. And women were healers. And what do you see in the caduceus today? The symbol for the medical profession is a snake. So these symbols are there all along. And so you put them in and make them negative as a way of putting down this previous worship of the goddess. I mean, this is done on purpose.
Okay, is Asherah, in your opinion, is that the same person as Atherat?
She is known as perhaps Astarte in other cultures, and she is the mother of Aneth. I'm not sure specifically. There's different ways of putting that together. Because
I've heard the story that Asherah, which might be Atherat, they might be the same person. She was either the wife of Yahweh or Jehovah at one point, the Canaanite version of that, or she was the wife of Amen-Ra in his original human form, or again, maybe both.
Well, what they discovered was a big, large piece of pottery in Israel. And on this pottery, there are symbols, drawings of a man and a woman, etc. And in lettering, it says Yahweh and his Asherah. So there's some archaeologists who think that means that Yahweh had a wife originally. Of course, there's some people who don't think it represents that, but it's very possible that when Yahweh was first conceived, there was a goddess alongside him. I think that would be a difficult thing to prove, but it's just like the divine assembly in the Old Testament. I mean, it says that God, Yahweh, reigns with other gods. Nobody talks about that, but it's there in writing, that there were multiple gods.
You know, there's a parallel with Amen-Ra, and that it might even be the same name, where he had a wife, and in one point in the original incarnation, and then at some point, the wife is kind of tossed aside, and he's no longer bound to a human manifestation. So he becomes the air god, becomes literally air.
I
So,
see.
and so this is how he suddenly exists everywhere, because he becomes the wind that you feel. And this is what everybody thought was the spiritual realm. I think is amusing, is based entirely on man's misunderstanding of the particulate matter that is air. Because when they talk about like Jesus giving up the ghost, for example, when he's on the cross and he gives up the ghost, well, that's one way of phrasing it. The other way was he breathed his last breath. So that means the same thing. The breath of life is the ghost. It is the spirit, and the spirit of God moving over the waters in Genesis 1. That's literally the wind.
Interesting.
So it also there's references to people being picked up by the whirlwinds and such. The idea of the genie is based on dust devils, and it's all disturbances of air that people just put a spiritual aspect to. And then by the time we figured out what air was, we no longer realized that this was what people were making up when they were coming up with their spirits ideas.
Interesting. Very interesting.
If you look at the science on breathing, it's actually something that nobody would have ever imagined, that we're taking all of these elements out of the air and running our little cellular machines with them. It's actually beautiful, more so than a made-up story.
And in Ecclesiastes, my favorite passage, Ecclesiastes 3:18-21, it talks about men are beasts, and it says, who knows that the breath of the man ascends to heaven, and that the breath of the beast descends into the earth. And that's translated, again, depending on which version of the Bible you read, as spirit. So again, it's still talking about air.
Interesting. Well, certainly this whole duality of mind and body and spirit and body was influenced by other civilizations, whether it's Greek or Zoroastrianism, because that really wasn't present. That wasn't present early on. I think it's fascinating to see how these concepts develop and why they developed, like you're explaining here. I was just writing before this video my blog post on why do we toss coins in a fountain? We do things today that have deep roots in another culture. And tossing coins in the fountain, they found a whole bunch of metal in this river that they're excavating in London that's under a street, and it was a votive. It was, I'm going to throw this in the water and maybe the God will do something nice for me. And when you're in Rome, you go to Trevi Fountain and you toss coins. You still have no idea why you did that. So cultures incorporate elements of other cultures quite readily. And whether it's the Israelites picking up on the Babylonian myth or the Egyptian rite of circumcision, they all kind of get blended together. So if you take a clear look at it, it's created. It's just created.
Well, I know the European monasteries in the Middle Ages would accept financial donations in exchange for salvation. You could literally buy your way into heaven. So maybe that's what these people are doing.
Well, and Luther, the Protestant Reformation, a lot of that was built on being against indulgences. But the other thing, we were talking about Luther, one of the things Protestants did was give up all the saints and give up the Virgin Mary. And I think if you see in the Catholic faith, holding on to women's saints, holding on to the Virgin Mary was satisfying this need for the goddess, this need for the female. So not only was Luther misogynistic, but he got rid of any image of female that was in the Christian religion. And I'm not saying that praying to a Virgin Mary is a good idea. It's not really something that a woman could be a Virgin Mother, but there was some acknowledgement that women might be involved, and Luther got rid of all that.
I remember some Hindus explaining, the first Hindus that I ever met in my life were explaining about their aspect of the religion. And of course, I didn't have presence of mind to inquire what that was, but they were talking about how they had a egalitarian belief system where they had temples dedicated to goddesses and of equivalent power and all of this. I wish I followed up on it, because I don't hear much about that kind of situation anymore.
Their presence is there's definitely a presence of goddesses in religions like Hinduism. However, I think if you go to the country and see how that's implemented, they may pray to the goddess, but women aren't equal. I talked to Aruna Pap. She's a Canadian. She has done work for the last 30 years on honor killings and trying to train police officers about the danger of that situation. This is more than just domestic violence. And she spent her whole career doing that. So I think even though they do have goddesses in their religion, it hasn't resulted in equality for women.
Yes. And we were at a debate where I think J.T. Everhard was debating a Hindu representative, and he said that a lot of the misogyny you see in those cultures, like honor killings and making women bear the onus for being raped, even by male relatives, like they weren't covering themselves enough or something like that, is cultural and not religious. It's strange. Like for instance, in I think East India, a lot of girls can't go to school because they can't take care of their menstrual needs and stuff like that. Partly poverty, but partly shame in dealing with it. So.
Well, I think it's true. There's a lot of cultural norms that you can't necessarily directly align with religion. However, I do think that religion, I would put right up there as one of the top causes of subordinating women.
And I would have to agree with that. I mean, yes, it's cultural, but then so is religion, and religion seems to, if it doesn't generate the negativity, it takes advantage in perpetuating it. I mean, I know people that are good, decent people that are drawn to Christianity because they think that's where good, decent people go. They think they've been trained to associate that with goodness. But at the same time, religion also kind of masks credulous thinking and superstition and schizophrenia and a number of other defects in thought. So that you can have people that are encouraged to listen to the voices in their heads and to imagine things just beyond whatever. Remember, these people once upon a time accepted dreams as evidence in court.
Well, and one of the things that I wasn't aware of was this issuance of the Malleus Maleficarum, which is the witch's hammer, and these two bishops wrote all the reasons why witches should be killed, and there were hundreds of thousands of women and men, but mostly women, who were killed during the Middle Ages because they were accused of being witches. I mean, it's really amazing.
And they don't follow any hard definitive criteria either, because as I said, at that time, they were actually accepting testimony of, I had a dream that she was a witch, therefore if that's what it takes, then we're all doomed. And I was glad that in the 1600s, they finally made it a law in the United States that you can't take spectral evidence, which means that of course that all the time up to then they had been.
Well, if you read about the Salem witch trials, there were these young girls who came and said, "Oh, she did this and she did that," and those women were killed because of who knows what the reason behind it was, but they obviously made it all up.
Yes, and part of that actually was dreams being evoked as evidence.
Like, so they would say that someone came to me in a dream and afflicted me, and who was it? And they would point to them in the courtroom. Cotton Mather was really kind of obsessed with finding witches, but his father, Increase Mather, actually was part of the reason why we don't accept spectral evidence in courts anymore, because he said, this is his reasoning, and it's logical within the religious framework, that can't the devil send dreams too? So how can you accept this as evidence? So,
interesting point. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and that's why spectral evidence isn't used, and that helped a lot with stopping some of the witch hunts.
All right. So, any other plug that you want to give on your book? We'll give a closing argument, or if there's anything else you want to throw in before we've got another 10 minutes or so.
Sure. I would just repeat the name, Women Beyond Belief, Discovering Life Without Religion. It's available, should be available soon in bookstores, but it's available online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can order the Nook or the Kindle version if you want. There'll be an audio version later on. And I also have a blog, and it's located at www.faithlessfeminist.com. And if you just Google Faithless Feminist, you'll find my YouTube channel and Facebook. And I'm on Twitter with my real name at Karen_Garst. And I try to write once a week. I write about women and religion, and I accept guest posts. So if somebody out there wants to write about something impacting women in religion, obviously from an atheist perspective, I really encourage them to contact me. They can email me at Karen@faithlessfeminist.com. It has been fascinating to read the many books I did and then be able to write about them. And at my age, writing about them helps me remember them.
There is one thing on our channel. It's kind of channel specific. Whenever the word feminism comes up, a lot of people in the comments go a little bonkers. And
That's putting it mildly.
you just saying that you're the faithless feminist, you'll get a lot of people saying, but feminism is about female superiority, or look at all the bad things that these particular feminists did. Feminism isn't about equality anymore. But I see people like you and other women, like in Texas, demonstrating for the reproductive rights, and I don't. For me, it's a spotlight fallacy to say that a few extreme people who did things that, if it was about superiority, it's not about feminism because that's about equality, represent an entire diverse movement of people. What do you have to say about that?
Well, that's fascinating. I worked with a marketing person, Dennis at Greenlight Digital, and his first suggestion for my blog was godless grandmother. And I said, okay, let's not emphasize I'm a grandmother, okay? And he came up with faithless feminist. And I thought, well, that's great. I've always identified as a feminist. I have been amazed at the last 30 years and what's happened to that word. I'll give you an example. I usually post my blog to various atheist Facebook groups. And one of them was called No Gods, No Masters, which is Margaret Sanger's word. And then it said, I think, atheist feminist. And Shanna Babyloni and I had done this post about we need more secular men. You know, it's probably not something I normally would have written about, but we did it and I posted it. And the conversation started on this Facebook page about, she's kidding, right? She's making this up. This is for fun. And I said, excuse me, no. And one of the things I said was, the suffragist movement. There were men involved in the suffragist movement who wanted women to have the right to vote. And we wouldn't have achieved that without that partnership. And they absolutely became hysterical and said, oh, I suppose she wants to bake them cakes. And I lasted about 20 minutes when they kicked me out of the group. So I've seen some of this extreme, but it's a small percentage. I explained that I'm a second wave feminist. However, I understand that gender equality can intersect with issues of race, economic status, etc., and expand the impact that has and create different experiences for different people, for different women based on those other factors. And I think that's totally logical. But there is a lot of, pushback against the word feminist. Well, I'm still proud to use the word feminist. And to me, it means gender equality. And until we have gender equality around the world for women, I'm still going to call myself a feminist.
Well, I guess that part of the problem that I have with some of the people on YouTube is that I am a little older than many of them. You're talking about things that you remember. I remember things too that I don't think the millennials could possibly even be aware of, which is why I didn't have a problem with that title. Because it's the same thing when you're talking about, where there was no availability of birth control, when it was casually expected that, well, I'm not even going to go into all the things that were casually expected. We'll just leave it. But it was a different society when I was a little boy. And I remember there was some significance to the difference. And it's certainly different than it is now. And
Well,
people don't realize how much the culture has changed.
on the point of birth control, Texas ranks as the lowest uh, for maternal mortality because of lack of access to birth control, women's health services, because our government is male dominated, and they are choosing to do bill after bill restricting women's reproductive freedoms rather than do the business of the state, such as infrastructure. Like, we had a fertilizer plant blow up right next to a school because they're busy deregulating things and giving people tax cuts, and it's a big religious diversion. And that might sound controversial to some people in the secular community, but that's the reality a lot of women face. More women are dying because of public health policy toward women in Texas. And this shouldn't be, because we're going backward now because the rate has climbed because of this behavior. So I consider abortion rights as contraception rights too.
Absolutely. And, there's always going to be, and there's always been abortion. The only question is it going to be safe, accessible, and affordable? And that is crucial.
All right. I don't know if there's anything else we need to add. Is there anything either of you need to say before I close this out?
Well, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be on your show, and thanks to Lalandra for writing, and the book's in the mail, Lalandra. You should be getting your autographed copy this week.
All right, I appreciate it. Thank you for
Thank you very
inviting
much.
me to write for your book.
Thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and close it out.